Hello, it's Maria Teplova here, and today we're going to be talking about Banksy. Banksy is a contemporary graffiti artist who's known for creating political and thought-provoking works on the sides of buildings across the world. His identity is anonymous, but his work is still really famous. He's a modern artist not just because he's alive today, but especially because modern art is a movement of art that focuses more on the meaning of a piece and getting a certain message across over how aesthetic or beautiful it is. This being said, his works are still masterful and pleasing to the eye, as he uses complicated stenciling techniques with spray paint. In order to create a clear composition to get his message across, he uses silhouettes, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So a silhouette is the exact shape or outline of an object or figure without seeing any details inside of it. It's a really important tool within art and design because it's essentially what our brain remembers after we're done looking at something. So this means that in order to create a clear composition, you want to have all the silhouettes to be organized and expressive at the same time. Silhouettes have always been crucial in creating artworks in all cultures during all periods of time. It can be anything from film and photography to cave paintings and vases, but the silhouette is what's creating the personality and the purpose of a certain object or character. And a silhouette doesn't have to be black on white, it just has to be made from sharp contrast, as you can see on these Greek plates and vases. The compositions such as these are a bit more complicated and more colorful. You can still see that the contrast made between lights and darks and um, contrasting colors is enforcing these silhouettes. Even in modern compositions, it's still equally as important to have a clear and balanced composition made from silhouettes. In this painting, you can see that the silhouette is made from a vibrant red contrasting with a more dull green. However, today we're just going to be practicing with black on white. So I'm starting by just sketching and planning out my idea on a piece of loose paper. You want your piece today to have some kind of meaning or message behind it, but I wanted to keep mine pretty lighthearted, so I just wanted to make something that would express the joy of music. I'm going to be portraying a man playing the guitar to a couple cats. I want all three characters to have their own distinct personality, so that's exactly what silhouettes are for. While drawing the man with the guitar, I was constantly looking back and forth between different references of real people playing the guitar so that I can create an accurate depiction. In the final drawing, I'll be following the references more closely to get an as accurate drawing as possible. On the side here, I'm figuring out, using a silhouette, what kind of personality I want the cats to have. I'm making one tall and lanky, while the other's more short and stout. For the man, I want to enforce how cool he is, so I'm going to be shading in parts that represent this coolness, such as, a hat, sunglasses, and a suit. I'm also making some accents on the guitar black so that it still stands out. I didn't really like how triangular the composition was, so I added a few music notes on top to balance it out and make it more of a diamond. In a composition, you want all your silhouettes to be clear, balanced, and serving some kind of purpose. As you transfer your sketch onto your final piece, make sure to keep your pencil as light as possible so it's easy to erase any mistakes and also build up the drawing as it gets more detailed. This is when I started following references of people playing guitars more closely. You can combine elements from different references. For example, I was using the hands from one reference, but the position of the body from another, but you should make sure it's still cohesive and makes sense anatomically. Now that the final drawing is pretty much done, I really lightly shade in all the parts I'll be painting black, so it makes sense to me later. We're going to be using black watercolor today, so here's some things you should know. When you're using a watercolor brush, the more lightly you press on it, the thinner the line will be. If you want lines this thin, you have to keep it really light. You're barely pressing against the paper. You can use these thin lines to create texture and shading, but also to use them for thin outlines, which I and probably you'll be using today too. The harder you press against your brush, the thicker the line will be and most likely darker. But the darkness also depends on how much ink you have or color you have versus how much water is on the brush. You can start with a thin line and press harder for it to go bigger. You can do repeated thin lines or repeated thick lines, all based on how hard you're pressing on the brush. As I mentioned before, you can create a really dark wash or a really light wash based on how much color you have versus how much water you have. If you dip your brush in a lot of color and only dab it in some water, it'll be dark. But if you soak the brush with a lot of water and just dab it in the color, then it'll be light. Remember to always be gentle with your brush, especially when you're using watercolor, and to always have the brush hairs follow your hand instead of your hand forcing the brush hairs against the paper. It'll feel unnatural, it'll cause damage to your brush, and the marks will be less elegant. You can see that I'm being extremely careful with this brush, utilizing both the thin and the thick lines so that I can first outline it and then fill it in with wider brush strokes. It might also be useful to you to flip your paper around for certain areas that you don't accidentally smudge things that aren't dry yet. To outline things like the guitar, I use an even thinner watercolor brush and I press so lightly so for these really thin lines. I go really slow and I do it very carefully. It's usually a good idea to go from left to right or from your non-dominant side to your dominant side so that you don't smudge things that are still dry as you work on the piece. I'm pretty much done filling everything in, so now I'm just gonna draw in these steps using a thin ink pen and a ruler. And I'm also gonna add in some little details like the whiskers. Our last step is to erase any leftover pencil lines and make sure everything is clean.